Welcome, everyone. Today, I am so excited because we have Michele Custer, who is a licensed educational psychologist. She has been practicing school psychology for 15 years. She hails from the East Coast, has worked in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and now California. She has worked in private schools, public charter schools, alternative schools, and partial day hospitalization settings. Lots of commas in your intro here, Michele. Her professional interests include ethically sound practices, social emotional learning, multidisciplinary teaming and collaboration to support high risk students, and legislative advocacy. She is currently the chair of the California Association of School Psychologists Legislative Committee, and she is an adjunct faculty member of Sacramento State, where she helps in the training of school psychology graduate students. I am so happy to have you here, Michele. Welcome.
Why, thank you.
Well, we kick off with really important questions that everyone always wants to know. What is your favorite TV show that you are watching right now? What should we all be watching with you?
Oh my gosh. So I am always behind the trends. My family makes fun of me because, like, I just finished Friday Night Lights. I said I was pretty sure I was in like graduate school whenever this was going on. I never watched it. And so right now I am watching Suits, which I hear they're going to be making some new seasons. So maybe I am ahead of the curve on that one. And then I love to read. That is what I do for my mental health time. And so I just read The Apples Never Fall Far from the Tree. I'm not sure if that's like the actual title of the book, but I saw on Peacock that they just did a mini series on that book. So it was a great book, and so I started watching the series.
Now, I have to ask, are you usually more in love with the book or more in love with the TV or film version?
Come on, you know the answer to that. Yeah, no, already my husband's watching the series with me, and 5 minutes in, I'm like, yeah, actually, the story took place in Australia, not in West Palm Beach. But yeah, always the book.
Yeah, that was me. I remember when Harry Potter came out and I saw the first movie, and I was the person in the movie that was like, they skipped that part, they didn't do that. That's incorrect. And I didn't enjoy the movie because it wasn't perfectly aligned with the book. So I'm like, I will reread the books, but maybe not the movies.
Absolutely. Hunger Games is the only series that I felt like the movie really did justice to the book. But
Okay. All right. Well, in one sentence, how would your colleagues describe you as a school psychologist?
I don't know that I can do a sentence, but I could do some adjectives.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would say that people have always said I'm very passionate. Um, I can remember my going away from party from when I moved from Maryland back to Pennsylvania, and everybody said that I was a trailblazer. And at the time, I was young, out of grad school, and I was like, what does that really even mean? Like, and now I live in California, and I'm like, oh, I know what a trailblazer is. Yeah, so I think I'm a mover and a shaker, and that's what my colleagues would say about me.
Well, how long have you been a school psychologist? And at what point in your journey did you become focused on the topic of threat assessment, which we're definitely going to get into today?
Yeah, so not to say that my intro wasn't correct. It was just a little dated, which
Oh,
is okay. That's all right. Hey, I believe this is my 19th year practicing as a school psychologist, and it wasn't really until recently that I maybe put together how foundational threat assessment was in my career looking back, because I always say I'm kind of a unicorn. I knew that I wanted to be a school psychologist my freshman year in college, and that was because I had a psychology professor who was a school psychologist. And I remember very clearly being in my dorm room watching on TV the events of Columbine unfold in 1999. Yes, February of 1999. And it was right at that time that I had decided that I was going to commit to the path of school psychology. And so, looking back now at some of my experiences, I think about how impactful that event was on my career path and my professional identity. And I was in a creative writing class at the time, and I still have this journal entry that I wrote, probably within days of Columbine happening.
Well, tell me more about what you find regarding threat assessments in the school setting.
Yeah. So this, it's just crazy how the universe kind of compels you to do things, right? So when I started my career back in Maryland, I did not know that my interest and my focus was going to be working more with our at risk juveniles in schools. And so I had done my dissertation proposal on reading disabilities and internalizing disorders, and I was a credentialed elementary teacher before going into graduate school. And so I went off to Maryland and had a phenomenal internship experience in a county school system. And when they offered me a position, they said, these are some of the sites that we're thinking. And by the way, we're going to move our alternative education program in the county from a night program to a fully operational school. And I had done part of my internship was working with students in what was then called an ED program for students with emotional disabilities, and I loved supporting that group of kids. And so I remember I went home and I thought about it for a few days, and I called and I said, yeah, I want the position at the alternative education program school. And so, in that work early on in my career, it was the case that I was very much involved in conducting threat assessments. And many of the students who came to our program had been long term suspensions from high schools or middle schools throughout the county. And for risk of violence behaviors. And so, the first time that I had to work with a team to do a threat assessment, I remember calling my supervisor, and he, referred me to a handbook of best practices that had been generated by the county, and connected me with other psychologists in the county who had done threat assessments. And and it was a team process. And so I was fortunate enough that my foundational experiences were roughly modeled around best practices.
Mhm.
Of course, in the last 20 years, there has been some evolution, but really, when you get back to it, the core principles around comprehensive school violence prevention and safety specific to threat assessments, we have had the guidebook, the gold standard since 2001. And so for me, and that came out of the Safe Schools Initiative, that was a collaboration between the Department of Justice, the National Threat Assessment Center, and TAC, and the Department of Education, and it's based off of case analyses of targeted violence that had happened up until that time. And of course, this came out of a task force following Columbine. But the core components of that study and of the guidelines are just as true today as they were in 2001. So we know how to do this in schools, but yet it is the case time and time again when I am supporting schools that that knowledge is not out there and in the hands of the people who need it. And so that is what got me started. I was having a conversation with a girlfriend who happens to be in public policy and advocacy and legislative work. And she said to me, she's like, "Well, why don't you do something about this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what am I supposed to do about this in the state of California?" And so just through grassroots efforts, a school psychologist and a mom sitting at a table having a conversation. And so I did reach out to my local legislator, who happened to be the co-chair of the education committee for the California Assembly. And this was prior to me even knowing anybody at CAS, our state association. But I was able to work together with my assembly member to get a legislative bill introduced. It did not pass through, but it exposed me to the whole how an idea can become a bill and the legislative process. And no joke, I wish my friend Dora was sitting here beside me. We, I had to watch the Schoolhouse Rocks video on
That's what I
how
was just thinking of. Yes.
for real. I had no clue, zero clue. So so that conversation I had with my friend that started all of this legislative advocacy that I'm continuing to grow within that space and build capacity within that space. But that started in 2018. And so, it I had the chance to testify at the education committee and speak to my experiences in schools, and I, just as one person, one practitioner, have had so many personal experiences, including working in school systems where there were students who actuated murders that were well thought out and planned and premeditated, and looking back on those failed opportunities, essentially, to potentially have prevented that violence. And so, the need for understanding is out there, and it's not just within our profession. What I have found a lot is educating our school administrators about the need to bring more people into the circle to help inform how we can support, because that's the goal, is to support individuals who are at risk, and convincing them that it's beyond an assessment. It is beyond a one point in time report. It is about connecting children and families and communities with resources to help improve, lives.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious because obviously, I mean, just anyone listening to this right now can hear your passion on this topic. I'm kind of curious, how do I want to phrase this? Like, how did you get from, a lot of us are very passionate about topics. A lot of us sit there in our schools and see things that are broken, things that need to improve. You have taken a number of steps. I'm just kind of interested, like, what advice would you give to someone who sees these kind of concerns in their own environment, but they're so afraid to take those steps, right? I mean, most people are not going to be like, I would love to go call my legislator right now, right? That could be a big step. Testifying, those are big steps. What kind of made you like get to that next step and say, I'm not just going to sit here and vent about it and be frustrated about it, but I'm also going to try and really do something about this?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I hope that I can answer them in a way that is impactful. You know, I you, I'm thinking about the prepared school psychologist, right? Your tagline, and thinking about how just fortunate I was to really have excellent training and excellent mentors along the way. And I do think that, um, I get back to Simon Sinek, who, is kind of this organizational leader, and he talks about how businesses and companies and corporations that want to sell a product, they look at the process and how to get it out there and what it is and how it misses the mark because it it it, it has to come back to the why. And so I do I especially in talking with graduate students and future leaders in the field, I think that you cultivate your why by actively and being open to information that is out there. And so when it comes to at your site level or your district level, it really was my experiences trying to share this information with colleagues and hitting roadblocks that fueled my that fueled me to continue and I guess to blaze some trails. And so unfortunately the truth of the matter is that because schools are tasked with so many things that it isn't until a mandate or a lawsuit or a high profile case or unfortunately a situation where it's in our media because of um, you know actuated violence that those become the opportunities to really push the resources and the information out there. And so I encourage people to fall back on lessons learned from failure. And so that is one of my key resources that I always share whenever I'm talking, whenever I'm doing threat assessment training. There is an article, and you don't necessarily know from reading the research article the exact incident that it is referring to, but it stems out of a shooting that happened in Arapahoe High School in Colorado, and that particular event, the parents of Claire Davis, who was a student who was killed, really wanted there to be a thorough investigation for the sake of learning what went wrong to help
Mm,
prevent it from happening in the future. Oh, and I just got goosebumps. And so they did a very thorough investigative post analysis, and that individual who committed the shooting, he was assessed by the school psychologist and one of the assistant principals, and that in Colorado, they do have some strong they're not mandates, but they are guidelines at this time around threat assessment trainings. And so the members of the school community had just completed a solid threat assessment training, and they had protocol and they had policy. And so even with like a good foundation, there were errors in that process. And so I like to share that research article with students so that they can use that as kind of an impetus to say, hey, listen, not only are we ethically required to ensure the safety and the well-being of our students, but look at what happens whenever best practices are not followed.
Right.
And recently in California, in a case that is potentially going to set precedents throughout the country, there similarly there was a threat assessment process that happened in and I believe it was Kern County. So that lawsuit was Cleveland versus Taft. Taft was the school district, and it was the first time that the courts held the school system liable for
Mm.
financially for responsibility um, of because they had failed to implement a solid threat assessment process. And so it's the first time that a school district had been held liable and found to be liable because of failures. And so that is a key um, court case that, again, I feel like you can take to administrators, you can take to school boards, you can take to community stakeholders, because it did also involve the school resource officer and some limits and barriers around information sharing, which is usually a big topic of concern. That is a perceived limitation, because ultimately, when it comes to safety, safety first, do no harm, information sharing is not prohibited by FERPA or by HIPAA whenever there is a concern for safety. And so, yes, so sometimes we have to look at the failures to help move our cases forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about like that last article to be able to go to your school and be like, we don't want to be the next school held
That's
liable,
right.
right? So it's unfortunate that sometimes very big things like this have to happen in order for change to happen. But if we have some of this information that exists out there to be able to utilize it. So
And the
for
other thing
go ahead.
too, oh, sorry, Jenny. Yeah, no, the other thing too that I think is really helpful, specific to this topic, is that there are so many free resources out there through our kind of governing bodies and government agencies. So this is I am I was fortunate to be one of the mental health uh, collaborators that was sent to the FBI's behavioral analysis unit at Quantico to be trained in what's called BTAM, so it's behavioral threat assessment and management. And the concept is we have to have multidisciplinary teams that are coming together to have an investigative mindset, because our assessments and our plans for supporting individuals are only as good as the information that we gather in terms of what are the risks, but then what are the protective factors and mitigating factors, and creating a really robust community of support and individuals around the person. And to do that, you need multiple disciplines sitting at the same table and collaborating. And so that training, getting back to one of your questions earlier about like why me or how me, I'm just a school psychologist. I definitely had that feeling when I'm, sitting at the FBI, behavioral analysis unit in Quantico, and I'm there with forensic psychologists and clinical psychologists and the social workers who are working on co-response models with law enforcement agencies, and really some people who are doing very high level work in very large systems. And I was one of two psychologists in the room, and I was so excited there was another school psychologist. Shout out to Minnesota. But part of that is because of grants through the Stop Violence grant that is partnering law enforcement with education to help develop these teams and to work collaboratively. And so um, what I want to say is there is a ton of resources out there and free training out there. So school psychologists can reach out through the emergency management system, the Office of Emergency, OES, the Office of Emergency Systems. The National Threat Assessment Center is doing a ton of free training specific to school systems right now. That they're talking about ways to report concerns and the bystander effects. Um, your local FBI office. This is part of a big initiative because of failures that they had in their system after Stoneman Douglas. That they are working with county leaders in mental health education and law enforcement to come together to create multidisciplinary teams. So there's a lot of funding out there for implementing multidisciplinary threat assessment teams in schools. And there's a lot of opportunities, even as a school psychologist, and I empower you to say, as a school psychologist, I am an important member of this community and this team. To get the information out and to help support the development of these teams and communities. So if this is something you are passionate about, I promise you there is opportunity at various levels to get involved.
Well, thank you so much for those resources. We'll make sure to include links to those resources in our show notes so that if anyone is interested in taking advantage of these free opportunities for training and different things like that. Are there any other actionable steps? I mean, I feel like you've shared a lot with us already. Is there anything else that you would share for someone who is interested in learning more or moving forward with improving practices at their schools?
I think knowing, so if you are prepared, then you are always ready, right? And as we know in our field, it's not if a crisis, evolves. It really is when. And
Right.
so I think it's so important to know where to get the resources to support your practice, and that's true for any of the areas that or any of the hats that we wear. And so, NAF has a really great, what was it? It was a virtual symposium on school safety. And they have some really fantastic resources there. Um, I can't say enough about the importance of being paying the membership dues and being a member of of your national association, of your state association, of your local chapters or affiliates, of Jenny's training platform, because it is these platforms that have vetted the resources that are being shared and are able to kind of be a one-stop shop. And so it really is an investment in your preparedness to be paying for and having these resources available to you. And one of the great things about getting involved, I'm in California, it's a huge state. When I moved here, not being native, people were like, yes, welcome to the country of California, which is so true. But getting involved in your local communities, and there's opportunity to get involved, at the state level, and at the national level. But what happens when you do that is you meet people. You meet people who have rich experiences and or expertise in areas, and you then can phone a friend. So I mean that in California, if you're a member of CAST, there is literally Ask an Expert, which is a resource. And so if you are practicing and all of a sudden there's a potential threat that you've been asked to support, and you're like, oh crap, like what do I do? And you're freaking out. Um, you can literally email help at casponline.com, and they would connect you potentially with me or with somebody else in the state. And Jenny, I know, from your platform and the training we did for the county, for the psychologists in the county where I work, somebody said, hey, I don't know, I'm being asked to do this calcula assessment, and I like, what do you think? And I'm like, go to your Jenny P resources, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's right, thank you so much. And so it really comes down to knowing where to get the good information and having access to it that helps you be prepared for the many tasks that you will be lucky enough to help support school systems through.
Yeah. Well, we like to ask all of our guests, reflecting back to when you were a first year school psychologist, what advice would you give to someone who's kind of finishing up that first year or about to embark on their first year?
Don't stay in the box. um, y- you know, I thought I would be super passionate about dyslexia and reading intervention. My first year out, like that, I thought I'd be an elementary school psychologist forever. And I didn't say no when new opportunities were recommended, and it was because of that, because I did not have tunnel vision, because I was open to any opportunity or experience that I was exposed to, that I was really able to grow in who I am as a professional and who I am as a person. And so my advice would be, don't let anybody put you into a box. You are more than a special education assessor, evaluator, report writer. And when you see something that is scary, but is speaking to you, that means that you need to say yes and go try it out.
I love that. I love that. Well, this podcast, as we know, is called the Prepared School Psych. You've already talked about the term prepared a couple of times, feeling ready. What do you do to help yourself feel more prepared in your role?
Oh, well, I am super involved in my school psych community. And so for me, that means bringing in speakers it means saying hello, making myself available to new people in the profession. I love talking to graduate students. I'm inspired by them, and that fills my cup. And so I think it is about doing more for me than just my 9 to 5 job. I think, oh, that's so funny, 9 to 5 job.
I know, I'm like, you mean
Yeah, right.
7:30 to
Yeah,
7 p.m., right?
yeah, right. But but for me, that is renewing, right? Like being involved in conversations with other professionals, and staying current, because I'm asking questions from others and wanting to know more. I think that's what keeps me prepared.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michelle, and for sharing all of your expertise with all of our listeners. Again, we're going to share all the different resources that you've been talking about in our show notes in case anyone would like to follow in your path and help improve these different systems that are so important in our schools. So, thank you for your time today, Michelle.
Thank